Welcome back to part 2 of my CSS crash course. In this video, we're going to be talking about the CSS box model. Now, when I originally recorded this crash course, I was thinking it was going to be just a single long video, but it got, as with a lot of my videos, got a little bit long and I had to break it up into parts. So this is part 2. This CSS crash course is part of my full stack web developer roadmap series, so check out this video to see an overview of that. Anyways, let's jump into the video and get started. In my opinion, the best way to understand the box model better is to just look at it interactively. And a great tool to use to do this is the Firefox Dev Tools. So we've talked about this in prior lessons, but we're coming back here. And as you can see, I've got this HTML document here in the browser. And then what I've done is I've selected the content element that I've just made a single div, and I've put some text in that div. And what I've done is I've applied these 5 styles that are pretty directly related to the box model to see how these play out, on an actual web page. So as you can see, if we go to the layout section of the dev tools, so we're up in an inspector, we go to layout, and then we can scroll down to see the box model. And this gives us an incredibly interactive way to see what each of these represent. So if you go through and you want to see how, wide is the content and how tall is it, you come into these little properties and you can hover over them, and you see on the left side of the screen, it gives you an outline of exactly what that is applying to. Furthermore, we can see that we've got some padding in here, and again, it's highlighted up on the screen. It gives you a really nice outline of where that padding sits. Furthermore, we've got a border. It outlines that really nicely for us, and then even some margin on the outside. Now, there are other tools that help you visualize this, like in Google Chrome. So if we came back to Google Chrome, you can see that if we're just looking at let's go ahead and just select one of these elements here, then you can come down to the box model and you can kind of see what's going on, but in my opinion, it's just not quite as good as Firefox, so that's why we're working in Firefox in the first place. But tools aside, what actually is the box model? Well, the box model represents these pieces that we're looking at, but more specifically, you have the content itself, which is going to be, text or just some space that we've defined by a width and a height. And then outside of that content, we then have some sort of padding, or it doesn't have to be set, it could be 0 padding, but in this case I defined 20 pixels of padding. And then outside of that we have a border, and then outside of that we have a margin. And within this box model, I mentioned that it tells us how much space an HTML element represents within the web page, and the properties that play into that are going to be the width, the height, the padding, and the border. Now the margin's a little bit different because while it does take up space, it doesn't actually define the space taken up by that individual element. It kind of adds some space around the element, so that if you have 2 elements and they're squished together, you can just kind of space them out a little bit. So those are the components of the box model. Let's go ahead and dive in with some, I actually made a code pen that's going to allow us to interactively play around with this box model. So on my screen, I've got a code pen I've got some JavaScript written up in here. You can drop down these select elements and select different CSS properties to apply to this orange paragraph tag up here. And why I created this is because when we're talking about the box model, sure, we can get into width, height, padding, border, margin, all that kind of stuff. But what's really confusing about the box model and CSS in general is that based on the values that you're passing to certain properties, the rules of the game completely change. And to highlight some of those rules, I thought it would be helpful to put together this example and just visually walk you through, if we switch a certain CSS property, what is that going to do to our HTML element that we're targeting? The first property that I want to really touch on and dig into is the display property. So this is a related property to the box model, and once again, the box model is not just one thing, but this is highly related to what we're talking about here. And if we scroll down to our documentation, I've just gone to MDN, Technologies, CSS, the reference, and scrolled down to the index. And we can find the display property somewhere in here. So let's scroll down, see if we can find it. Here's the D section, and we'll go ahead and click display. So it says this property sets whether an element is treated as a block or inline element in the layout used for its children, such as flow layout, grid, or flex. So there is a lot packed into this single property, and honestly, it's probably the most complex property that you'll deal with when you're writing CSS. But we're going to dig into each piece of it, and you're not going to have to read all of this documentation. I'm just going to walk you through it. So you can see that there's there's a lot of different things that you can pass to this property, but the main ones are going to be block, inline, inline block, flex, and grid. So if we came back to our box model example, if we came down to the display type right here and did the drop down, you can see that we have all of these different possible values, excluding flex and grid. And the reason we're excluding those is because Flexbox and CSS Grid are going to be totally separate videos that are going to require a lot more explanation. So for now, forget about those. We're just going to focus on these ones right here. So by default, whenever you're dealing with most HTML elements, you're going to have a display property of block. But at this point, it doesn't mean anything to us. Like, what does block mean? What does inline mean? Since Flexbox and CSS Grid are kind of out of the equation here, we're just focusing on block, inline, and inline block display types. And based on what you set your elements, they're going to interact with the page and flow through the web page a lot differently. So it kind of changes the rules of the game. Now, by default, each element is going to have a certain type of display. Now, most elements are going to have a display type of block. And you can see in this example that the default display type of a P element is block. But if you were to look at another type of element, so if you come up to the HTML that we've got here, it's a little bit messy, but this span element, which is represented by this green text, that's actually going to be, by default, an inline element. So the question is, how do we know which elements are going to be, by default, a block and which ones are going to be, by default, inline? And then furthermore, what do they actually do? What's the difference between a block and inline element? To understand this, we've got this example laid out. So watch what happens when I switch a block element to an inline element. So I'll drop this down, I'll say inline, and you'll see that that orange div is going to jump up to the line before it. And it's going to share that same space with the span element. Now that's the behavior of an inline HTML element. So what you'll see here is that since a div element has a natural display type of block, what it's going to do is occupy 100% of its container space. And in this case, the container is 100% of the body HTML tag. So it's occupying all of that space. And furthermore, the height, if we don't give it a height, specify it explicitly, it's going to automatically take up the height of the content within it. So however large this text is how big of a height this element's going to occupy. The second thing about block elements is that these elements occupy their own space. They don't share lines with other elements. So as you can see here, our div in orange with the orange background occupying all the space, and it's also on a different line than this green span element that's right above it. And the span element actually has a default value of inline rather than block. So different rules up there, but since this one is a block, then no other element can occupy the same space as it. The next thing about a block element is that it respects its width and height properties. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet, but you will see what I'm talking about in just a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down the content width, and this is just going to apply a 400 pixel width to the orange element. So you can see that it no longer takes the entire width of its container because we've explicitly given it a width. And then furthermore, we can give it a height of 200 px or pixels. So now it's occupying a space of 400 by 200. So what happens if I were to do the same thing with an inline element? Let's go ahead and see. So I'm going to reset all of the properties. So we're going back to the beginning. And now what I'm going to do is come down here and set our div to be a display type of inline. And you can see when I click that, it comes up onto the previous line because inline elements actually can share space. They don't break to a new line by default. You'll also notice that they don't occupy all of the space. They just occupy the size of the content within them. So it's just occupying the text that's within this div because we've set it to that display type of inline. Now the last interesting thing is that unlike a block element that obeys or adheres to its width and height properties, the inline element is not going to. So even if we set the content width to 400 pixels, not going to change at all. We can also try that with the height, set it to 200 pixels, not going to work. So in other words, if you set it to inline, width and height CSS properties are not going to work on it. So as you can see, depending on one property's value, you have different rules of CSS, which can get pretty confusing sometimes, and it's why I'm spending so much time on it here. Now the last one that we have not talked about is a combination between the two. So just to review, a block element is going to take all the space of its container, it's going to take a height of the content within it, and it's going to break to a new line and respect its width and height properties. An inline element is going to just be the width and height of the content within it. It's not going to break to a new line, and it's also not going to respect the width and height properties if you try to set them. Now an inline block kind of adopts a couple attributes of both. So the main difference, if we were to switch this inline to inline block, then the only difference is now it's going to respect its width and height properties. Right now we don't have those, or I guess we do have those set. We have tried to set the content width and the content height, but because we have an inline element right now, it's not respecting those dimensions. But the second we change this to inline block, we're going to get those width and height properties back, just like we saw with the block. But in this case, we can still make it inline. So although it's broken to a new line here, that just happens to be the case because it's too large to fit on that line above. So inline block just basically takes all the properties of inline, but instead of ignoring width and height, it now respects those properties and takes that space up. This concept may not seem super important to you right now, but I promise you as you go through knowing whether you're dealing with a block element or inline block is going to be super important. And then further down the road, when we start talking about Flexbox and CSS Grid, it becomes even more important to understand this kind of stuff. Let's go ahead and reset everything here. And the next thing that we need to talk about are box model variations. So to this point, we just looked at the Firefox DevTools and you can visualize the box model pretty well. But there's actually another way of conceptualizing this box model and using it. Just like the display property and all other CSS properties have their default values, the box type down here is going to have a default value of content box. So that's what we're seeing right here. But we can switch this to be something called border box, which is basically going to change how all of those properties, so width, height, padding, border, and margin, it's going to change how those relate to each other within the box model. To understand this, let's go back to our Firefox DevTools, and let's go ahead and calculate the total size or space that this particular element is taking up. So the way that we would do this is by adding things together because the default box type is content box. So basically what we have to do is if we want to define the total height of this element over here, we could of course just hover over it and we can see exactly what the height is. But if we wanted to calculate this, we just come down into the box model and we say, okay, what is the height of the content? Well, the height of the content is going to be 100 pixels. So we say 100 and then we add on whatever the padding is on both sides. So we add the top padding and the bottom padding, which on both sides is going to be 20 pixels. So we go 20 plus 20 is 40, plus the content height of 100 is 140. And then on top of that, we add the border dimensions, which is going to be 5 pixels on the top and the bottom. So in total, the total height or space in height that this occupies on the web page is going to be 100 plus 20 plus 20 plus 5 plus 5. So that equals, I guess, 140, 150 in total. And then the margin, the additional 20 and 20 or 40 pixels, that's not actually going to play into the box model. That's kind of separate from it. It doesn't actually indicate how the total height of this element. So let's go ahead and see if we can hover over this, and you'll see that if we hover over the entire element, it's showing in pretty small text that the height is 150, just like we calculated. So again, 100 plus 20, 20, 5, and 5 is our total height. And then likewise, we can do that with the width. So we grab our content width, which is 400. We add both of the paddings on the left and the right, which is 40. So we got 440. And then we add the border, which is 5 and 5. So we got 440 plus 10 is 450. And that's when we hover over it is what the width is going to be. So that calculation that we did seems awfully complicated. And it kind of is, because we're having to add all these different components and consider, okay, what's the left padding, what's the right padding, what's the left and right border. You know, it would be a lot easier if we could just define, I want this element to be 400 pixels wide and 200 high, and be done with it. And then have all the rest of the padding and border and stuff just be within it. And that is what the border box value of the box type property allows us to do. So all we have to do is come to the styles of the element, and then we say box type, and we say we want border box. Now, if we apply that, it's not going to work because, let me see why. Invalid property name. Oh, I must be blanking on what we're actually using here. let me see what we're talking about here. So box type. So I was totally blanking out. It's not box type. It is box sizing. That box type is just what I named it in our code pen. But if you say box sizing equals border box, you'll see that this changes just a little bit. So let me go ahead and uncheck this and watch the content up in the left, top left. You'll see that something is going on here. And it's really hard to tell what that something is when we just have one element on the page. But what I've done is put together another code pen that really helps us visualize the difference between the border box and the content box. Now stick with me here because I know it seems a little bit boring and why would we need to worry about box sizing? But when we start making grids and we start, putting elements within other elements, it's going to become really important to know, how much width do we need to give to children element to fit within the parent container, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and dig into that example that I created and you'll see exactly what I mean. So as I mentioned, when we flip that box sizing from content box to border box, it basically takes the calculation of the space that HTML is occupying and it changes it. So now, instead of taking the content height plus the padding plus the border to get our total height, we just look at the height property and that is our total height. And it's a lot easier to kind of reconcile in our brains. And furthermore, it makes it a lot easier to put elements within other elements. So as you see on the screen here, what we're looking at is a couple of divs, and I've got a child div and a parent div. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to fit the child div within the parent and not have it break out of its space. And if you see on the right side where we've got the output of this, you can see that the content box, we've got the parent container, which has that's just a picture background, that's not CSS. But that's the space that it's occupying. And you can see that the child with that border on it, because border, has an impact on the total size of a content box, you can see that by adding that border, we're breaking out of that parent container. And that's really going to be a problem when we're trying to arrange elements on the page. So furthermore, if we were to add padding to this, basically what this button is going to do when we click it is it's going to take the child element, which is the one with the border on it, and it's going to add some padding to it. So when we click this, you'll see that it makes it break out of our parent container even more, and that's because when we add padding or a border to something that has a box sizing of content box, it's going to add space to that element. It's always going to be additive. Now, when we come down to a border box type element, it's not going to. So what's going to happen is the content width and height is going to be adjusted based on how much border and padding there is. So you can see from the start, we're already fitting the child element, which is got the black border, right on top of the parent container. And if we add some padding, instead of getting larger, it's just going to make the content within it a little bit smaller. So let's toggle the padding, and you'll see that this text right here is going to come inwards a little bit. But we're not going to see the border break out of that parent container. So I understand that this is a little bit confusing, especially if you're just starting out in CSS, but I really wanted to introduce this concept because you will stumble upon this down the road, and you'll probably see, like I said, something like a CSS reset. So let me go ahead and grab that code that I'm talking about and show you exactly what I mean. Oftentimes, you'll see in a CSS style sheet the following thing. And this is going to change the stuff over on the right a little bit, but that's not the point. What you'll see is that on the HTML element, or the root element, they're going to change the box sizing to border box. So it's going to take the root style and make it, this nice little handy border box where, the width is the width and the height is the height, and there's no math going on there. And then these next couple of rules, similar to what we talked about, where if you put a comma there, it will select multiple, classes or IDs or tags or whatever. That's what these are doing, and this is a wildcard character that's basically saying, I want to target every element in this entire document. And then what it's doing is it's saying, I want to set the box sizing property to inherit, which is basically going to look up and say, okay, what is the root element set to? Whatever that's set to, inherit that down to all of the different elements on this web page. So in effect, what we call this is a CSS reset, and it's going to change the default box sizing to this more easy to understand border box, box sizing. All right, I know we've covered a lot. We've come a long way in this crash course so far. We are not done yet, but I want to do a quick little review on a few things. So we've learned about how do we select things. How do we select HTML elements? We've learned about what takes precedence when we have multiple CSS rules, and we've learned about the box model. And what I want to review here is the box model, and just go through a few things that you should keep on the top of your mind. So first off, the box model describes how much space an HTML element occupies. The space is heavily influenced by that box sizing property that we just talked about, whether that's content box or border box. So content box, you have to add the content width and height to the padding in the border. Well, with the border box, you just take the width and the height, and that is the total space that your HTML element occupies. So the space is also, or space and layout is also heavily influenced by the display property. So whether we have a block element, an inline element, or an inline block element is going to influence where those elements are sitting on the page. So those two properties, box sizing and display, are going to really play together, deciding how our web page is laid out. And furthermore, that display property has two additional values that we have not talked about but will. So Flexbox and CSS grid, which is going to allow us to make grids, and it's going to allow us to space elements out really well. So that's going to be super useful to us in the future. And finally, the most important components of the box model are height, width, padding, border, and margin. Margin doesn't play into the total space it occupies, but it does control the space around it. And then finally, all other CSS properties are going to be kind of supplemental to these core concepts. So whether we're styling the text color, or we're doing a background image, or making a different font, those are all going to be just kind of supplementary to these core concepts. What I would recommend is that you come to this little example that I put together It's in the description. And just click through all of these attributes, or not attributes, but CSS properties, and see what happens with different combinations. So change the display type to inline, and then try to set, different margins and paddings and stuff like that. And you'll see like, okay, the margin doesn't really do anything when it's inline, but the padding does. And then if we set this to block and then change the margin, then it is going to do something. So try to play around with these properties. It's really an interesting way to learn the different components of the box model.